Thomas Miller stood at the back of the crowded auditorium, his weathered hands gripping an old digital camera. At 78 years old, he had seen many important days in his life. But today felt different. Today, his grandson Jake was graduating from high school, and Thomas wanted nothing more than to capture every moment on camera. The old man wore his dress green army uniform, the same one he had worn decades ago during his service in Vietnam. The fabric was a bit tight around his middle now, and some of the ribbons had faded with time, but he wore it with pride. His wife Martha had suggested he wear a regular suit, but Thomas insisted. "This is a special day," he had told her. "I want Jake to remember that his grandfather served his country." The auditorium buzzed with excitement as families found their seats. Parents held balloons and flowers, siblings fidgeted in their chairs, and grandparents like Thomas positioned themselves for the best photo opportunities. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, casting warm light across the sea of proud faces. Thomas had arrived early, despite his daughter Sarah's protests that he didn't need to stress himself. "Dad, we'll all be sitting together in the family section," she had said, but Thomas shook his head. "I just want the pictures," he replied simply. "I want to make sure I can see everything clearly." His camera was nothing fancy, just a basic model he had bought at the local electronics store 3 years ago. He wasn't good with technology, often asking Jake to help him download the photos to his computer. But he was determined to document this milestone himself. The young man graduating today was his pride and joy, the first in their family to finish high school with honors and head to college in the fall. Jake had always been special to Thomas. When Jake was little, he would sit on his grandfather's lap and listen to stories about the army, about far-off places, and about the importance of serving others. Unlike other kids who grew bored with old war stories, Jake hung on every word. He asked questions about the medals, about the places Thomas had been, and about what it meant to be a soldier. "Grandpa, were you scared?" Jake had asked once when he was 8 years old, pointing to a photograph on the mantel showing Thomas in jungle fatigues. Thomas had thought carefully before answering. "Sometimes," he said honestly. "But being scared doesn't mean you don't do what's right. It means you do it, even when you're afraid." Now, watching the graduates file into the auditorium in their caps and gowns, Thomas felt that familiar mix of fear and pride. Not fear for his own safety, but fear that time was moving too quickly, that moments like these were becoming more precious, because there might not be many more of them. The ceremony began with the national anthem. Thomas stood straighter than anyone else in the room, his right hand over his heart, his eyes fixed on the flag. Around him, some people sang along, others just listened. But Thomas felt the weight of every word. He had served under that flag, had seen friends die defending what it represented, and had come home to a country that didn't always welcome its veterans with open arms. Those were different times, he reminded himself. Jake's generation understood respect and gratitude in ways that his own generation had to learn the hard way. When Jake was accepted to college on a partial academic scholarship, he had hugged his grandfather and said, "I want to make you proud, Grandpa. Like you made our whole family proud when you served." As the principal began calling names alphabetically, Thomas raised his camera and started taking pictures. He wasn't worried about getting the perfect shot. He just wanted to capture everything. The proud smiles of parents, the nervous excitement of graduates, the way the light caught the gold tassels on their caps. "Anderson, Michael," called the principal, and Thomas watched as a young man walked across the stage to receive his diploma. Each name brought them closer to Miller, Jacob, and Thomas felt his heartbeat quicken. The old man noticed other veterans scattered throughout the audience. There was a woman in her Navy uniform 3 rows ahead, a middle-aged man wearing an Air Force jacket, and several others wearing military pins or hats that identified their service. It made him feel less alone, less like an old man out of place in his formal uniform. Thomas had served 2 tours in Vietnam between 1967 and 1969. He was just 19 when he first set foot in that humid, dangerous country, and 21 when he came home to a world that had changed while he was gone. The protests, the anger, the way people looked at him when he walked down the street in uniform, those memories still stung, even after all these years. But he had learned to focus on what mattered: his family, his community, and the young people like Jake, who represented hope for the future. When Jake was born, Thomas made a promise to himself that his grandson would grow up knowing that his grandfather's service meant something, that the uniform represented sacrifice and honor, not shame or controversy. Martinez, Isabella, called the principal, and Thomas realized they were getting close to the M names. He adjusted his position slightly, wanting to make sure he had a clear view of the stage when Jake's moment arrived. The camera felt heavy in his hands, but he held it steady. At 78, his hands weren't as strong as they once were, and he sometimes trembled when he was tired. But today, with adrenaline and pride coursing through his veins, he felt steady and focused. Thomas thought about all the pictures he had taken over the years. Photos of Jake's first steps, his first day of school, baseball games, birthday parties, and family gatherings. Each one was precious to him, a small piece of history that proved his grandson was growing up surrounded by love and support. The old man had never considered himself a photographer, but Martha often said he had an eye for capturing important moments. "You don't just take pictures, Thomas," she would say. "You collect memories." And that's exactly what he was doing today, collecting a memory that would last long after the ceremony was over. "Miller, Jacob," announced the principal, and Thomas felt his breath catch in his throat. There was Jake, walking confidently across the stage, his cap slightly crooked the way it had been all morning despite Sarah's attempts to fix it. He looked handsome and grown up in his graduation gown. But Thomas could still see traces of the little boy who used to build forts in his backyard and ask endless questions about everything. Thomas raised his camera and started taking pictures rapidly, not caring if some were blurry or poorly framed. This was Jake's moment, and he wanted to capture every second of it. The handshake with the principal, the moment Jake received his diploma, the proud smile as he turned toward the audience. When Jake spotted his grandfather in the crowd, he gave a small wave, and Thomas felt tears sting his eyes. Through the camera lens, he watched his grandson mouth the words, "Thank you, Grandpa." And Thomas knew that all the years of stories, all the lessons about service and honor, and all the love he had poured into this young man had been worth it. As Jake walked back to his seat, Thomas lowered his camera and wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve. The ceremony continued. But for him, the most important moment had passed. His grandson was officially a high school graduate, ready to take on the world with the values and strength that had been passed down through their family. The old veteran looked around the auditorium again, taking in the joy and celebration surrounding him. This was why he had served, he realized. Not for the politics or the protests, or the complicated history that surrounded his generation's war, but for moments like this, for the freedom that allowed a young man like Jake to pursue his dreams, for the peace that made celebrations like this possible, and for the future that stretched out ahead of them all. Thomas Miller adjusted his uniform jacket, checked his camera to make sure the pictures had saved properly, and prepared to meet his family after the ceremony. He had gotten what he came for, the pictures that would preserve this day forever. But more than that, he had witnessed the next chapter beginning in the story of a young man he loved more than life itself. The ceremony was almost over now, but Thomas knew this was really just the beginning. After the ceremony ended, families poured out of the auditorium into the bright afternoon sunshine. Thomas Miller moved slowly through the crowd, his camera safely tucked into his jacket pocket. The photographs were secure. And now he looked forward to finding Jake and the rest of his family for the traditional post-graduation pictures and celebration. The school courtyard buzzed with activity. Graduates hugged their friends, posed for countless photos, and shared excited conversations about summer plans and college preparations. Parents and grandparents mingled, introducing themselves to other families and sharing in the collective joy of the day. Thomas spotted his family near the large oak tree where they had agreed to meet. Sarah was already taking pictures of Jake with his diploma, while Martha fussed over his graduation cap and gown. His son-in-law Mike was recording everything on his phone, trying to capture video messages from Jake for relatives who couldn't attend. As Thomas made his way toward them, navigating through the crowd with careful steps, he noticed a tall, broad-shouldered man, in a navy dress uniform approaching from his left. The man was probably in his early 40s, with the kind of bearing that immediately identified him as military. His uniform was crisp and perfectly fitted, and his chest displayed an impressive array of ribbons and medals. The naval officer paused directly in front of Thomas, effectively stopping the elderly veteran in his tracks. For a moment, neither man spoke. The younger officer's eyes were fixed on Thomas's army uniform, specifically on the ribbon rack above his left breast pocket. "Excuse me, sir," the naval officer said, his voice respectful but firm. "I couldn't help but notice your uniform. I'm Commander David Rodriguez, U.S. Navy SEALs." He extended his hand, and Thomas shook it, feeling the strength in the younger man's grip. "Thomas Miller," the old man replied. "Army, retired. Well, more like long retired." He attempted a smile, uncertain about where this conversation was heading. Commander Rodriguez's expression became more serious as he studied Thomas's ribbons more closely. "Sir, is that a silver star I see there? And a bronze star with V device?" Thomas glanced down at his chest, suddenly feeling self-conscious about the faded ribbons he had worn with such pride just moments earlier. "Yes, that's right, but those are old stories, Commander. Today is about my grandson." He gestured toward the oak tree, where his family waited. "With respect, sir, those aren't old stories. They're part of our history." Rodriguez's tone carried the kind of reverence that made Thomas look at him more carefully. "Would you mind if I asked where you served?" "Vietnam," Thomas answered simply. "2 tours, 1,967 to 1,969. But like I said, that's ancient history now." Commander Rodriguez shook his head slowly. "Sir, with all due respect, it's not ancient history to me. My grandfather served in Vietnam too. Army like yourself. He passed away before I could really understand what that meant." He paused, studying Thomas's face. "Would you mind telling me about those medals? I mean, if you're comfortable doing so." Thomas felt an familiar discomfort rising in his chest. Throughout his life, he had met people who wanted to hear war stories, usually expecting tales of glory and adventure. But the memories attached to those ribbons weren't glorious. They were complicated, painful, and deeply personal. "Commander, I appreciate your interest, but this really isn't the time or place," Thomas said gently. "My family is waiting, and this is supposed to be a celebration for my grandson." "Of course, sir. I understand completely." Rodriguez glanced toward the oak tree where Thomas's family was gathering. "But before you go, I want you to know something. I've been in the Navy for 22 years, and I've served in Iraq and Afghanistan. I've seen what courage looks like in combat, and I know what those medals represent." The two men stood in an awkward silence for a moment, surrounded by the happy chaos of graduation day. Thomas could see Jake looking around, probably wondering where his grandfather had gone. Sarah was checking her watch, and Martha was shading her eyes with her hand, scanning the crowd. "The reason I approached you," Rodriguez continued, "is because I wanted to say thank you. Not just on behalf of myself, but on behalf of every service member who came after you. What your generation went through in Vietnam, the way you were treated when you came home, that should never have happened." Thomas felt his throat tighten. In all his years since returning from Southeast Asia, he could count on one hand the number of times someone had thanked him for his service. The homecoming parades and heroes' welcomes that modern veterans received were foreign concepts to men of his generation. "I know you said those are old stories," Rodriguez pressed on, "but they're not old to the men who didn't make it home. They're not old to the families who lost sons and brothers and husbands. And they're not old to those of us who get to serve today because of the sacrifices your generation made." The words hit Thomas harder than he expected. For decades, he had carried the weight of his service quietly, never expecting recognition, never seeking acknowledgement. The protests, the anger, the way people had spit on soldiers returning from Vietnam, all of that had taught him to keep his experiences private, to wear his uniform only on special occasions, and to consider his service a personal matter rather than a source of public pride. "Commander," Thomas said quietly, "I appreciate what you're saying. I really do. But I was just doing my job." "We all were. That's exactly why it matters," Rodriguez replied. "You were just doing your job in impossible circumstances, facing an enemy that didn't play by conventional rules, fighting a war that the people back home didn't understand or support. And you did it with honor." Thomas looked again toward his family. Jake had spotted him now and was waving, pointing him out to the others. The young man's face was bright with happiness, and Thomas realized that this conversation with the Navy SEAL was taking precious time away from Jake's special day. "I need to get back to my family," Thomas said, starting to move toward the oak tree. "Wait," Rodriguez called out. "There's something else. The Silver Star. That's not something they hand out lightly. What did you do to earn it?" Thomas stopped walking and turned back to face the younger officer. For nearly 50 years, he had avoided talking about the incident that earned him that medal. The memories were too painful, too complicated, and too tied up with the loss of friends who didn't survive the war. "Commander, that's really not something I discuss," he said firmly. "I understand, sir. But I want you to know that whatever you did, it mattered. It saved lives. And it made a difference." Rodriguez reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. "If you ever want to talk to someone who understands what service means, please give me a call. I mean that sincerely." Thomas took the card and glanced at it briefly before slipping it into his jacket pocket next to his camera. "Thank you, Commander. That's very kind. One more thing," Rodriguez said as Thomas turned to leave again. "Your grandson, the graduate, he should know about what you did, not the details if you don't want to share them, but the fact that his grandfather is a genuine American hero." "He's not interested in old war stories," Thomas replied. "He's got his own future to think about." "You might be surprised," Rodriguez said with a slight smile. "Young people today, they understand honor and service better than we sometimes give them credit for. And from what I can see over there, that young man loves his grandfather very much." Thomas followed Rodriguez's gaze to the oak tree, where Jake was now actively searching the crowd for him. When Jake spotted the two uniformed men talking, he said something to his parents and started walking in their direction. "Grandpa," Jake called out as he approached. "There you are. Mom's getting worried, and we want to take pictures before the light changes." He stopped short when he noticed Commander Rodriguez standing next to his grandfather. "Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, Jake. This is Commander Rodriguez," Thomas said. "Commander, this is my grandson, today's graduate." Rodriguez extended his hand to Jake with a warm smile. "Congratulations on your graduation, son. Your grandfather and I were just talking about service and sacrifice. You should be very proud of him." "Lard," Jake looked puzzled, glancing between the two older men. "I am proud of him," he said simply. "He's the best grandfather anyone could ask for." "Do you know about his medals?" Rodriguez asked, gesturing toward Thomas's ribbon rack. "Some of them," Jake replied. "Grandpa doesn't talk much about the war. He says it's more important to focus on the future than the past." Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. "That's wise advice. But sometimes the past helps us understand how we got to the future." He turned to Thomas. "Sir, with your permission, I'd like to tell your grandson what those ribbons represent." Thomas felt trapped between his desire to keep his wartime experiences private and his growing realization that this Navy SEAL was offering something he had never received before: recognition from a fellow warrior, respect from someone who understood the true cost of service. "Commander," he said slowly, "I really think we should save this conversation for another time." But Jake was looking at his grandfather with new curiosity, and Thomas could see questions forming in the young man's eyes. Questions that maybe, after all these years, deserved honest answers. Before Thomas could respond to his grandson's curious questions, the rest of the family approached the group. Sarah arrived first, followed closely by Martha and Mike. All of them drawn by the sight of Thomas, in deep conversation with the impressive naval officer. "Dad, there you are," Sarah said, slightly out of breath. We were starting to wonder if you'd gotten lost in the crowd. She glanced at Commander Rodriguez with polite interest. I hope we're not interrupting anything important. Not at all, Rodriguez replied warmly. I was just introducing myself to your father and congratulating your son on his graduation. I'm David Rodriguez. He shook hands with each family member as Thomas made the introductions. Martha studied the commander's uniform with the same attention to detail she had always applied to everything in her life. My goodness, she said softly. Look at all those ribbons. You must have had quite a career, young man. 22 years so far, Rodriguez replied. But your husband's ribbons tell a much more impressive story than mine. He served in Vietnam, earned a Silver Star and Bronze Star with V device for valor. The family turned to look at Thomas with expressions of surprise and curiosity. While they knew he had served in Vietnam and had always respected his military background, they had never heard the specific details of his decorations. Thomas had always deflected questions about his medals, changing the subject whenever the topic came up. A Silver Star? Mike asked, his voice filled with genuine awe. Dad, that's incredible. I had no idea. Thomas felt uncomfortable under the sudden scrutiny of his family. It was a long time ago, he said quietly. And today isn't about me. It's about Jake and his graduation. Grandpa, Jake said, stepping closer to his grandfather. I've always known you were in the army, and I've always been proud of that. But I never knew you were a hero. I'm not a hero, Jake, Thomas replied firmly. Heroes are the men who didn't come home. I'm just someone who was lucky enough to survive and make it back to build a life with your grandmother. Commander Rodriguez cleared his throat gently. Sir, with respect, that's exactly what a hero would say. The men who truly deserve those medals are always the ones who don't think they do. Martha reached out and took her husband's hand. In their 53 years of marriage, she had learned not to push Thomas to talk about the war, but she could see something different in his eyes today, a crack in the wall he had built around those memories. Thomas, she said softly. Maybe it's time Jake knew the whole story. He's a man now, graduating and going to college. He can handle hearing about what his grandfather did. Thomas looked around at his family's faces, all of them waiting for his response. For decades, he had protected them from the darker aspects of his military service, believing that his role was to be a grandfather and husband, not a war veteran with difficult memories. But standing here in his dress uniform, with a fellow service member who understood the weight of those ribbons, he realized that his silence might have done them a disservice. The Silver Star, Rodriguez said quietly, is awarded for gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States. It's the third highest military decoration. Whatever your grandfather did to earn it, it was extraordinary. Jake looked at Thomas with new eyes. Grandpa, please, I want to know. Thomas felt the resistance he had maintained for so many years beginning to crumble. Jake, war isn't like the movies. It's not glorious or exciting. It's ugly and confusing, and it changes you in ways you can't undo. I understand that, Jake replied. But you're my grandfather, and this is part of who you are. I've spent my whole life wondering about the man who taught me about courage and honor, and now I'm finding out there's so much more to the story. Sarah moved closer to her father. Dad, we've always respected your privacy about Vietnam, but maybe Commander Rodriguez is right. Maybe it's time we knew what our family hero actually did. The word hero hung in the air between them. Thomas had spent nearly 50 years rejecting that label, but hearing it from his daughter's lips made it impossible to dismiss completely. It was March 15th, 1968. Thomas began slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. We were on patrol near the Cambodian border when our squad walked into an ambush. Charlie had us pinned down in a rice paddy, with nowhere to go. The family listened in absolute silence as Thomas continued. Our radio operator was hit, and we couldn't call for support. 3 of my men were wounded and couldn't move. The enemy fire was coming from a tree line about 200 meters away. Commander Rodriguez nodded, recognizing the setup of a classic Vietnam firefight. What did you do? What I had to do, Thomas replied simply. I crawled through that rice paddy, staying low, trying to get close enough to knock out the machine gun nest that had us pinned. It took me almost an hour to cover that ground. Martha squeezed her husband's hand tighter, imagining the young man he had been, alone and terrified in a foreign land, making a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. I managed to get close enough to throw 2 grenades into their position, Thomas continued. It was enough to silence their guns and give my squad time to get our wounded out of there. But when the smoke cleared, I could see that some of the enemy soldiers were just kids, Jake. Younger than you are now. The pain in Thomas's voice was evident to everyone listening. This was the burden he had carried for decades. The reason he had never wanted to talk about his medals or his service. The heroic act that saved his squad's lives had also forced him to take lives, and the complexity of that experience had never left him. That's what the Silver Star represents, he said, looking directly at Jake. Not glory or excitement, but making an impossible choice in an impossible situation, and living with the consequences every day since. Jake stepped forward and wrapped his arms around his grandfather in a fierce hug. Thank you for telling me, Grandpa. And thank you for doing what you had to do to come home to us. The simple acceptance in his grandson's voice broke something loose in Thomas's chest. For the first time in decades, he felt the weight of shame and secrecy beginning to lift. This young man, this bright and promising graduate, understood that heroism wasn't about seeking glory but about doing what was necessary when others were counting on you. Commander Rodriguez watched the family embrace with deep emotion. Sir, what you did that day saved American lives. The young men you brought home from that rice paddy got to see their families again because of your courage. That's something to be proud of, not ashamed of. I know that intellectually, Thomas replied, still holding his grandson. But knowing it and feeling it are 2 different things. That's what makes you a hero, Rodriguez said firmly. Heroes don't enjoy what they have to do. They just do it anyway. Martha wiped tears from her eyes as she watched her husband finally share the story that had shaped so much of their life together. She had known pieces of it, had seen him wake up from nightmares, had watched him struggle with invisible wounds that never quite healed. But seeing him tell Jake the truth, seeing the pride and love in their grandson's face, she realized that this moment was a kind of healing. Sarah put her arm around her father's shoulders. Dad, I'm sorry we never pushed you to tell us before. I understand why you didn't want to, but I'm glad we know now. It helps explain so much about the man who raised me. You don't need war stories to know who your father is, Thomas replied. You've seen him every day of your life. You know his character by how he's treated his family, how he's lived his values. That's true, Jake said, stepping back but keeping his hands on his grandfather's shoulders. But this helps me understand where those values came from. All those times you told me about doing what's right, even when it's hard, about standing up for people who can't protect themselves, about putting others before yourself. Now, I know you weren't just giving me advice. You were sharing what you learned the hard way. Commander Rodriguez reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Sir, would you mind if I took a picture of you with your family? This has been an honor for me, meeting you today. Thomas hesitated for a moment, then nodded. That would be fine, Commander. As Rodriguez framed the shot, Thomas stood surrounded by 4 generations of his family, all of them seeing him with new eyes. The old digital camera in his jacket pocket had captured Jake's graduation, but this moment was being preserved by someone who understood the true meaning of service and sacrifice. Thank you for your service, sir, Rodriguez said as he took the photos. And thank you for sharing your story. It means more than you know. After the commander left to rejoin his own family, the Millers stood together under the oak tree, processing everything that had happened. The graduation ceremony that had started as a simple celebration had become something much deeper, a moment of connection and understanding that would bind them together in new ways. So, Jake said with a grin that reminded Thomas of the little boy who used to sit on his lap, I guess this means I have even more to live up to than I thought. No, Thomas replied, pulling his grandson close. You just have to live up to yourself. Be a good man, work hard, treat people with respect, and stand up for what's right. The rest will take care of itself. As they walked back toward the school parking lot, Thomas felt lighter than he had in years. The pictures in his camera would preserve Jake's graduation day, But the conversation with Commander Rodriguez had given him something even more valuable. The knowledge that his service had meaning, that his sacrifices were recognized, and that the values he had tried to pass down to his grandson were built on a foundation of real courage and real consequence. For Thomas Miller, the day had started with a simple goal: to take pictures of his grandson's graduation. But it had become something much more important. It had become the day he finally came home from Vietnam, not just in body but in spirit, welcomed by a fellow warrior and embraced by a family who loved him not, despite his past, but because of everything that past had made him.